Hi everyone. This is the continuation of our previous topic on graph representation learning. So far we have seen the motivation behind graph representation learning. We have seen that the task of graph representation learning is to basically map a graph or different entities of a graph. It can be a node, can be an edge, can be a subgraph to an embedding space. Right? The embedding space can be an Euclidean space, can be a non-Euclidean space like in a spherical space or an hyperbolic space, right? And basically the idea was that the graph size is so large that most of the computations are very difficult to perform on the adjacency matrix, right? And then therefore we wanted to get a squeezed representation, a condensed representation, right? In some space. And this was a major motivation behind graph representation learning. And we have seen the topology, we have seen the taxonomy of different graph representation learning algorithms, right? So last lecture we have seen some of the basic naive implementation of GRL in terms of matrix factorization, right? We have seen approaches like line or GRAREP, right? And they have certain issues, right? The major issue is that ultimately you have to do matrix factorization, which itself is costly, right? On the other hand, if we come up with some ways to reduce the cost, right? Reduce the cost, time complexity in some ways, that would be helpful. And the second motivation is that a graph often changes over time, right? If you look at social network, changes over time, nodes are coming in, edges are coming in, nodes are getting deleted, dormant, and so on, right? So today we will discuss two paradigms. So first paradigm is more of a representation learning on a static graph, okay, where we will use another paradigm which is very different from the matrix factorization based approach. So this paradigm basically deals with something called random walk, right? And random walk, a technique we have already discussed in the link prediction, link analysis, link prediction chapters, right? So we'll see how we can leverage the random walk strategy to better understand the context of a node, okay? And then we will see that what are the drawbacks of this kind of techniques, and then if time permits, we'll also talk about graph neural network, right? Where we'll see that is more of a learning approach where state-of-the-art neural networks can be employed to solve this GRL problem. Okay, so let's get started. So random walk has been immensely popular in understanding the context of a node, right? So if you think of say first hop neighbor of a node, right? So first hop neighborhood structure is a context of a node, right? But people may ask that the entire first hop neighbor may not be enough. You also need to look at the second hop, right? Or people may say that look, first hop and second hop, there should be a trade-off. There should be a mix and match of both first hop and second hop neighbors to define the context of a node, right? Now, why this is important? Context is very important. Otherwise, how do you deal with the case that let's say two nodes are far apart from each other, right? But their context or their neighborhood structure is very same. Let's say two nodes, the neighborhood structure of two nodes looks like a star, right? How do we capture this thing? Because these nodes are very, very far apart from each other. So if you look at standard techniques that we have discussed so far, GRAREP or line kind of approach, they won't be able to capture these kind of similarities. Okay, so the first approach, which was proposed way back to 2014, called deep walk, and this is although this is little dated, but so far this has still been considered as one of the baselines for graph representation learning. Okay, so what is the task again? Let's quickly recap the task. The task is to come up with embeddings of nodes. Let's say ZV is the embedding of node V, ZU is the embedding of node U. So the embeddings are basically vectors, right? and you basically, look at the similarities of two vectors on the embedding space, right? If two nodes are similar, or two nodes are close to each other on the embedding space, right, which you want to create, they should also be close on the actual network, right? In other words, if they are closer if two nodes UV are closer to each other on the original network compared to say UW, right? On the embedding space also, U and V should be closer together compared to U and W, right? And the aspects that we discussed last day is that how do we define the closeness between nodes in a network? How do we define the closeness of two vectors, two embeddings on the embedding space, and so on, right? So the simple way to capture the closeness is essentially you take the dot product, right? So ZU, ZV, these are the embeddings. You take the dot product, and that would basically give you the similarities between two nodes. Okay, the proximity between two nodes. So now the idea is that that the probability that U and V co-occur on a random walk over the network can be determined by this quantity. What does it mean? Let's say you have a network like this, okay, and let's say this is U and this is V, okay, and you start a random walk from U. So the random walker can traverse through this node, through this node, through this node, through this node, right? So what is the probability that your given node is U, okay, you will encounter a node V, right? So this probability, now this probability is computed on the original network, right? And the idea is that we try to mimic this probability, we try to estimate this probability using this dot product. If the probability is high, if this conditional probability is high, this should also be higher. Okay, this is the idea. So now, what we are trying to do here, so the things that we have discussed so far here, it is written accordingly. So using a random walk strategy R, we try to estimate the probability of reaching V, right, in a random walk starting from U. Say this is U, and let's say this is V, right? We start a random walk from U, and we will see the probability of reaching the node V given node U. Okay, this is the random walk. Now this random walk can be of different types. For example, the random walk can be a simple uniform random walk where you give equal weightage to all the neighbors of a node, right? Say for example, this node has this neighbor, this neighbor, this neighbor, this neighbor, this and this, right? So with equal probability, you can move to any of the neighbors from you. Okay, so this can be uniform random walk. This can also be biased random walk, right? Where we say that no, I would like to move far from the given node, right? Or I would like to consider the first of neighbor first, and then I will move to the second of, and so on and so forth, right? Something like this. I move from here to here, and then from here to here, then from here to here, and so on and so forth, right? So I first encounter the first of neighbor, and then I move to the second of. This can be one strategy. Another strategy can be you just move through this. You first explore the depth rather than breadth, right? This is the idea. All right, we'll discuss all these things later. So we try to compute this probability, right? And what is the idea? The idea is that this probability should be proportional to the similarity between these two embeddings in the embedding space. So say this is ZU, this is ZV. We look at the cosine similarity, or say the dot product, right? And that would give you the idea about the probability of reaching that node given a particular. Okay, so things will be clear gradually. So just hold on. Okay, so this is the task. We want to come up with a d-dimensional vector representation which preserves the similarity, right? So what kind of similarity? The similarity is basically, as I mentioned, the nodes which are closer by in the original networks will also be closer on the embedding space. right? So how do we capture this closeness, right? So in other words, how do we capture the context? We capture the context using something called the neighborhood of a node, right? So U is the node, and in U is the neighborhood set of the node. Remember, this is a multi-set. What do I mean by multi-set? Multi-set means that a set can, within a set, a particular entity can appear multiple times. Okay, it can also happen in the random walk process. Say the node V is encountered 2 times, right? It's because this is after all random walk, right? You don't have control, complete control on the random walk process, right? So this can be a multi-set. So we will follow certain strategy R, certain random walk strategy R. It can be uniform random walk, it can be biased random walk, and so on. And then we sample, right, neighborhood structure of a node U. Okay, and then what we try to do, we try to estimate this one. Okay, so let's forget about this one. Okay, let's only look at the summation part. So for every node U, we measure the probability. So basically, for every node U in the graph, we measure the probability of encountering its neighborhood given the node structure, given the node, and this is the embedding that we want to learn, right? In other words, basically what I'm trying to say is that given let me further unfold it, right? So right, for every node U, for every neighbor of U, which is denoted by V, right? I want to get probability of V given U, right? And what do you mean by U? U is basically a node, right? And a node is represented by the embedding vector, right? So it can also be said that it can also be written in this way. Say probability of Z V given Z U, right? And I want to maximize this. I want to maximize this for all my neighbors, because this summation is done on the neighborhood node of U, right? Therefore, it is highly likely that the similarity between these two nodes, right, U and each and every neighbor of U should be high, right? I want to maximize this probability. Right? So this is basically a likelihood, right? And we know that generally we take log likelihood, therefore we take log, right? And we maximize this. And this is something that is unknown, Z, that is something that you want to learn. Okay. So let me read it out, right? So starting from each node. So what you are doing, you start from each node, you do a short fixed length random walk. Now the length of the random walk is fixed, which is kind of a hyperparameter, right? We say that, okay, we will do 10 hop random walk, or not 10 hop, random walk with random walk of 10 jumps, right? So the size of this NRU, this would always be 10, okay, for every node. So starting from each node, you run a short fixed length random walk, right, using some strategy R. Now from each node, right, you collect this NRU, which is very easy to collect based on this random walk process, right, which would be the nodes visited using the random walk. The set of neighbors NRU can be a multi-set, as I mentioned. A node can be visited multiple times. Now you optimize the embeddings using the equation in the previous slide. Okay. Okay. So this is something that you want to do. Now maximizing something is same as minimizing the negative of the same objective function, right? So we take minus and we want to minimize it. Okay. So now the question is, how do we measure this one? How do we measure this probability? Right? Now we can easily measure this probability using some sort of parameterized function, right? Something like this. Okay, what is this? This is essentially a softmax, right? So probability of V given ZU is e to the power, right? ZU transpose ZV by summation of e to the power, right? Z, W transpose Z, whatever. I mean, this can be, right? This is U, so U transpose W for all the W's present in the node set. This is one way of measuring the probability. You can have your own way of measuring the probability, but this is the simplest one, right? So essentially, we replace this probability by this one. Okay. So this is the resultant optimization function you look at here. Now for every node U, we first look at the neighborhood set of that U, which is NRU, right? Now for every neighbor V, right, we measure minus log of e to the power this by this, and this is the normalization. This is normalization because it's a standard softmax function. You want to keep it between 0 to 1. Okay. There's a problem. Okay. The problem is that, but this is good, and you can actually do it independently for every node, right? This is independent of each other, right? But the problem is that for every node, right, you need to do this thing. This is the beast, this denominator. For every node, you have to take the sum over all the nodes. And this makes the complexity of order of V square. Because for every node, we have to take we have to fetch the embeddings of all the neighbors, right? Of all the neighbors, and then you basically multiply, right? And that is time consuming. So what was proposed? If you guys are aware of NLP, techniques, there is something called node to wake, right? GLAV, this kind of approaches, which what to wake, GLAV, this kind of approaches, right? Where you have heard about something called negative sampling. Okay, what is negative sampling? So the idea behind negative sampling is that, in this denominator, which basically runs over all the nodes present in the graph, right? I will try to approximate it. I will not take all the nodes. I will not consider all the nodes for every node U, right? Instead, what I do, I will take a sample from the node set, from V, right? Now the sampling is totally dependent on you, right? For example, totally dependent on the user. U means you, the user, right? So how do you do that? So what they suggested is that, instead of taking all the nodes, you first get a distribution. Say PV is a distribution. Now this distribution can be a degree distribution. This distribution can be a scaled version of degree distribution or some other kind of distributions. Doesn't matter, right? Now from the distribution, you fetch k number of nodes, right? This k can be greater than NRU. The idea is that you give more and more. You basically take more and more negative samples which may not be a part of NRU, right? That would give you more evidence about the non-contextual nodes, and that's sufficient. So instead of running the sum over all the nodes, you basically run the sum over only k nodes, and those k nodes are sampled from a distribution. Okay. Now this distribution, as I mentioned, can be based on any topological property or any predefined distribution set. Doesn't matter. So if you are done with this, then let's look at the objective function. Now let's only focus on this part. Okay, log of this part. So this can be unfolded into two parts. This is basically log x by y, which is log x minus log y. So log of x minus log of y, right? So log of x minus log of y. I'll go to the details of this, right? So log of exponential of this, right? Log of exponential of this, right? So log and exponential will vanish out, right? So what we try to do, we try to again make this each and individual component a probability, right? Which ranges between 0 to 1. Now remember, this dot product will give you a scalar value, right? So if I pass this scalar value to say a sigmoid function, I hope you know what is sigmoid function, right? If you pass it to a sigmoid function, right, it would, so this is sigmoid function, right? If we pass it to a sigmoid function, this would basically return a number which ranges between 0 to 1, right? You will also get a non-linearity. So this is one, right? And of course you have log, right? And this is the second component, right? Where you do the same thing, right? Pass it to a sigmoid, right? Take a log, but here instead of summing it over all the nodes, you basically sum it over k sampled nodes, right? And this k sampled nodes are sampled from PV, right? Now PV is a distribution. As I mentioned, this can be a random distribution, it can be a degree distribution, it can be, you know, any distribution. Okay, and the idea is that as the number k increases, right, tends to infinity, this would be close to this one, because ultimately if k is infinity, or k is basically, if k tends to be v, for example, mod capital V, then this is same as this one, right? And if k tends to be 0, then of course you are not giving any weightage to the negative examples. You are only considering the the similarity between two contextual nodes, right? So we try to take a balance, make a balance between these two things by setting up a number for k. Okay, so now this is the final expression, right? I have already discussed negative sampling. I already discussed we generally take the negative sample, this k between 5 to 20, right? And when the sample size is 10, I mean the neighborhood size is 10, we basically take it between 5 to 20, right? So this we already have discussed. So in the deep work method, the strategy is that you do a fixed length, unbiased random walk process, right? And there are problems. The problem is that when it is unbiased, you don't have control on whether you just want to sample the the first of neighbor or the second of neighbor or what, right? So this can be done in a principled way, in a better manner, right? So in the next part, we will discuss an improved version of deep work called node to vec. There we will see another type of random walk process. So now we will discuss another method which has basically improved upon deep work approach. Now this is called node to vec, and this was published in KDD 2016. Okay, so here the idea is exactly same. We will do random walk, we will extract context, right? And then we basically optimize the same thing, right? But here we incorporate something called local context and the global context. Okay, so there are two things, right? So first one is, let's say these two nodes are there. Okay, these two nodes are there, U and V, and they are very close. They are close and they have exactly same neighborhood structure. So they should be mapped in the same embedding space, similar embedding space. Similarly, let's say this is a graph and there are some nodes here and there, and U, this W also looks very similar to U, but W is very far from U, right? So we should also map W near to you, okay, because of the neighborhood structure. But if you simply do unbiased random walk, right, you may not be able to reach W, or you may not be able to explore, you may not be able to look at the nodes which are far from you. Okay, so the first hop or second hop neighbors, these are local context, and the nodes which are far apart, these are global context, global information. So how do we systematically incorporate local and global information into the random walk process? Okay, this is the idea. So let's look at this example, right? Let's say you start your random walk from U, okay, and if the random walk size or the neighborhood size NRU is 3, right? So what are the options? One option is you start from U, you explore S1, S2, and S3, right? Another option is you start from U, explore S4, S5, and S6. So S1, S2, S3 is your local context because it only captures your first hop neighbor. Whereas S4, S5, S6, this is a global context because you are moving far from you. Okay. How do we capture the first hop neighbor? You can use a breadth first search, BFS. BFS looks at the you first explore the first hop, the second hop, and so on. Whereas if you want to capture the macroscopic view, the global information, you look at DFS, look at depth first search. So the idea is that you should have a control on whether you want to explore microscopic view or the macroscopic view, right? There should be a tuning parameter which basically tunes the way you want to do random walk process. Okay, so here instead of doing a unbiased random walk, we will do something called biased random walk. Okay, but a fixed length is fixed. So the size of NRU for every node U would be same. So let's say 10. Okay, and what are the parameters? There are two parameters. One is P and another is Q. Okay, P is called the return parameter, the return probability. Okay, meaning you start from U, okay, you jump here. What is the probability that you again jump back to U? Okay, so this is called the return probability, and there is something called Q, which is called in-out parameter. What is in-out parameter? In-out parameter is the ratio of BFS and DFS. If Q is high, you prefer BFS over DFS. If Q is low, you prefer DFS over BFS. Right? All right. So, let's think about it, right? So let's say you start from S1, right? You start from S1 and you move to W. You have already moved to W. You are currently at W. Okay. What are the probabilities now? Let's look at the probabilities. So with probability, now what are the possibilities? From W, right, you can either move to S3, you can move to S2, you can move to S1, right? So what we will do with probability P, you remember I said that there's a probability P which is return probability, right? So essentially with probability 1 by P, probability P, probability 1 by P is same because one is inverse of others, right? So with probability 1 by P, you move from W to S1. S1 is the original node from where you started your random walk, right? So with probability 1 by P, you again move to S1. Now P controls the return parameter. So P is a return parameter then. Now if you want to move far apart, right? So you see here what I said is that if Q is high, then you prefer BFS. If Q is low, then you prefer DFS. In other words, if 1 by Q is high, you prefer DFS, right? If 1 by Q is low, you prefer BFS, right? You see here with 1 by Q, right? You are actually moving to S3 or S4. This is uniform. Whether you choose this one or this one, this is uniform. The probability is same, right? And with probability 1, you move to S2. Okay, now think about it. This 1, now you can easily control on Q to decide whether you move here or you move here. Because this is 1 and this is 1 by Q, right? If you increase Q, what would happen? If you increase Q, this will decrease, right? This will decrease. So this will be preferred. If you decrease Q, right? If you decrease Q, this value, this weight would be higher than 1, even higher than 1, because Q is a probability, right? So 1 by a number between 0 to 1, you will have, right? You can have numbers greater than 1, right? So you reduce Q, then you basically prefer DFS. If you increase Q, you prefer BFS. Okay, you may ask that, okay, these are not probabilities, these are numbers, these are real numbers. We can easily make it probabilities. You can do some normalization, right? These are unnormalized weights. You take the sum, get a probability, you're done, right? So essentially, you have two parameters. One is P, other is Q. P determines whether you want to return to the original node, and Q determines whether you want DFS over BFS or vice versa, right? As you see here, right, we can essentially you take some examples and you get these numbers and then you normalize it. Okay, so let's summarize node to wake. We basically compute a random walk probabilities, right? You simulate R random walks of n length starting from each node U. Then you optimize the objective function, the same objective function that I mentioned in case of div walk, right? And how do you optimize it? It's a standard gradient descent. It's a likelihood, is log likelihood. You want to maximize log likelihood, you can use standard gradient descent techniques, right? You can so the beauty of this thing is that you can use these techniques, right, for different applications. For example, you can use it for clustering or community detection, right? Because ultimately you will get representations of all the nodes, right? And you can use, say, a simple k-means types of clustering to cluster nodes. You can make it. You can classify nodes. Say, assume that you know embeddings of nodes. You also know the labels of some nodes, right? You can train models. You can simply train a, say, logistic regression kind of models, or is SVM kind of models to where features are your embeddings, right? And you know the labels of some nodes, and then you basically classify other nodes, right? You can also predict links, right? Because now you have two embeddings, right? You have Zi and Zz, right? And you have some functions. This function is basically a link prediction function. Okay, and then your task is to get a representation of the edge. So you know the representation of two nodes I and J. Now you can get some sort of combinations of this. You can simply take the concatenation to get the get the embeddings of the pairs of nodes, right? There can be an edge, there cannot be an edge, right? You can take a simple Hadamard product. You can take some average, distance, whatever you want, right? So now things are easy. And so what's the problem here? The problem so far is that first of all, it is only suitable for static network, right? If, say, things change over time, you need to run this thing again and again on different snapshots of the networks. Second problem is that these embeddings are task independent, right? For example, say, if you want to get an end-to-end training mechanism where your end task is to predict links, for example, right? You cannot make it end-to-end. You cannot tune your parameters of embeddings, parameters for getting embeddings end-to-end based on, say, the loss that you obtained in the final task, right? So how can we make this thing end to end so that the tasks are now also, the embeddings are also dependent on the end tasks, right? And how can we, so these are okay. These are good for, static graphs when you quickly want to get a representations. You do not know the tasks at hand, right? You want to get a preliminary representations of the nodes. These techniques are useful. In fact, next we'll discuss something called graph neural network, right? There we'll see that initially we need to give some some inputs to the embedding layers, right? Some initializations of the embedding layers, right? So these techniques like node to wake, deep work, this kind of techniques can also be used as a pre-processing tool to get the embeddings of the nodes initially, and then you can do neural network as we'll discuss in the next slide. Okay, now this is all about deep work and node to wake. Okay, so now we will discuss more of graph neural network kind of strategies. So now we will discuss graph neural network. Now this slide is taken from Uriel Escobic's course on machine learning for graphs, and I will try to give you a brief of this part because we don't have enough time to discuss about this, but we'll try to give you a brief of this. This is an ever increasing research area, and you will see plenty of research on graph neural networks these days, right? Different fancy mechanisms borrowed from computer vision, NLP, right, and so on and so forth. So this is ever increasing. So I would strongly suggest you guys, if you're really interested in this particular domain, you look at papers published in graph mining kind of venues, KDD, NeurIPS kind of venues, dub kind of venues, and you will get to know about more about the state of the art these days on graph neural network. But here the idea is that I just want to give you an intuition behind graph neural network and why this is a powerful tool, right? Why this is useful. This is more useful compared to say deep work node to wake kind of methods. Okay, so a quick recap. I am pretty sure you have already learned what is embedding. Essentially, we want to learn a function which essentially maps a graph to an embedding space, right? And right, so that you would be able to solve downstream tasks. And this embedding space, the dimension can be 2D, 3D, ND, depending upon the need, right? So this figure we have already discussed. So every node is mapped to an embedding space, right? ZU, ZV are the embeddings of U and V. Idea is to, the idea is that if U and V are similar or closer in the actual graph, they should also be closer on the embedding space, right? And the task would be to come up with an encoder, right, which encodes a node, and map it to an embedding space, right? So, so this is something that was the crux of the entire discussion. We want to come up with a similarity measurement and some sort of similarity of two embeddings, right? So that these two are closer to each other, right? And we have looked at all these, simple naive strategies like lookup tables and so on and so forth. Problems. So the first problem is that, the techniques like node to wake, deep work, I already mentioned, right, is order of V square, right? For every node, you need order of V, parameters, right? Order of V parameters are needed. Now, order of V is not something which is expected when the network grows exponentially, right? This is one problem. The second problem is very crucial, that all the methods we have discussed so far, this only works when the entire graph is known beforehand, meaning it doesn't work when the network changes over time, right? When new nodes, new edges are coming in, right? It would not happen that you learn something on the given network and you basically get the embeddings of the upcoming nodes or upcoming edges. This is not possible. So all the methods that we have discussed so far, those methods are by default transductive. So I'm sure you know what is the difference between transductive transductive learning and inductive learning. Okay, so in transductive learning, we know all the data points, but we know the labels of some data points, right? But we know we are aware of the entire data points, but for some data points you know the labels, right? When you train the model, you know the entire data points, so you can also use those data points for which you do not know the labels, right? So here, if you think of deep work, not to wake, you know the entire graph. Okay, what is transductive learning? What is inductive learning? In inductive learning, you know the training set, right? You do not know the test set, right? You do not know the entire data set. You only know a part of the data set. Your model is trained on the part of the data set, and then you test it. You test your model on the unknown data set. Okay, so far the model that we have discussed, those are all transductive. They assume that the entire network structure is known beforehand. The third problem is that those embeddings methods do not take into account node features explicitly, right? If I say that, hey, I know the node features, right? Say for example, I know the the job, the location, etc. of a user, right? How can we use these node features into the embedding method, right? There is no option. So we'll discuss that how we can incorporate these things together, how we can come up with better learning paradigm, how we can incorporate, how we can make it inductive, right? How we can incorporate the node features into the embedding method, right? So we'll discuss the methods which are called deep graph embeddings or deep graph encoders, right? Those who do not have any ideas about deep learning, zero ideas about deep learning, I suggest that you go back, read some of the materials on basic deep learning. For example, start with perceptron, look at simple feed forward network, right? RNNs, right, or CNN type of mechanisms, and I think those things would be good enough to start from here, right? Go back and read some of the basics of deep learning. Okay, so this is the encoder that we want to build, we want to design. Okay, so the first technique that we'll discuss is called graph convolutional network, GCN. I'm pretty sure you have heard about this term GCN before. This is one of the fancy terms that people use these days. So, some of them may not know what is GCN, but as the name suggests, this also use convolutional operation. And what is convolutional operation? We have seen in case of image, right? What is convolution? Basically, let's say you have this grid which represents an image, right? You want to get a condensed representation of this image, right? What you do? You basically design a kernel or a filter, which what it does is this kernel actually looks at the local part of the image and gets some output. It can be a scalar output, it can be a vector output, but a condensed output. Say for example, this is 3 by 3, you get a 2 by 2, or you get a 1 by 1 matrix, right? Then you move this kernel to this position, and then you again get a 1 by 1 matrix, for example, and so on and so forth, right? So this is the idea. And then, so say for example, this is your image, original image. Once you pass your kernels, right, slowly you get a condensed representation. You further employ another round of CNN layer, you get further convolution, and so on and so forth, right? So now this is the idea. This is very simple. For in case of image, this is very simple because image follows a normal grid-like structure, RGB matrix, right? This RGB matrices, and then you process on each individual matrix, and you get some sort of condensed representation. This is also simple for speech or text, because speech and text, these are actually sequences, right? You have sequence of nodes, or sequence of utterances, and so on and so forth, right? It has a proper ordering, right? You can now, since it's a sequence, you can use RNN kind of method, LSTM, say for example, LSTM kind of method, and you get a representation of the sequence at the end of the layer, right? You get a condensed representation of the sequence. Now this is good, but what happens in case of graph? Because graph doesn't have a grid-like structure. I mentioned the last day that adjacency matrix looks like a grid-like structure, but adjacency matrix, if you modify, if you swap rows and columns, right? Meaning if you rename nodes, say you rename, there are two nodes, 1 and 3, you denote 3 by 1 and 1 by 3. You basically swap first row and third row, right? Doesn't matter, same. So even a systematic change in the adjacency matrix will result a same network. But in case of graph, in case of image, if you change pixel matrix, right, it would give you a completely different image. So because of the nice structure of this pixel, or because of the nice structure of this text or sequence, it is very easy to get a convolution kind of operations on this structure. But what happens in case of graph? Okay. So in graph, we do the same kind of convolution operation, right? We do the same kind of kernelized kernel operation, right? Using something called neighborhood aggregation, right? Let's think about it, right? What in case of image, let's say this is the region on which your kernel is focusing on currently, right? So from this region 3x3, you can get a 1x1 matrix, right? So essentially what you are doing, you are aggregating all these cells. There are 9 cells. You are getting an aggregation of cells in some ways. And the good part about this is that you know that in this particular region, this is the center. This is the center of the region. So when you focus on this region, right, you know this is the center of a region, right? And some ways you can think of it as a kind of aggregation of information from the peripheral regions, right, along with the central region, and you get some sort of combined output. In case of graph, what do you mean by central region or central node? Here is the idea. The idea is very simple but very, very attractive, right? So the idea is that you consider every node as a center, right? So this is your center. If this is your center, then what are the peripheral regions? The peripheral regions are your one-hop regions, one-hop neighbors, right? So let's assume that these are the neighbors, these are the one-hop neighbors. So you can also define a region like this here in graph, where now the region constitutes of the central node and the peripheral nodes, right? What you do now, you basically aggregate the peripheral regions representation along with the representation of the central node in some ways, right? As if you are getting messages from your neighbors and you are aggregating those messages. Now think of it as a kind of message passing paradigm, right? Say I am a node, right? And I have say 10 neighbors, right? So at time t, let's say at time t, I know something, right? And I am also getting information from my neighbors, right? So I get information, I am aggregating information from my neighbors. I am also taking my own knowledge, right? And then I update my knowledge. So in the second stage, so at time t, I update my knowledge, right? That the updation happens as a function of my own embedding and my neighbor's embeddings, some sort of aggregation. Now timestamp 2, again, my neighborhood, my neighbors may send another message, because at time t, I got updated, my neighbors also got updated. So at time t plus 1, I will further receive new information from my neighbors. right? So those information will further be aggregated along with my old previous knowledge, and then I will get an aggregated knowledge representation, and so on and so forth. This is the idea. And we do the same process for all the other nodes independently. Okay. So this is basically a message passing paradigm, but here there is no explicit message, right? What is the message here? Here the message is basically the embeddings, right? What I'm trying to say is that at time t, my embedding is determined by the embedding of my neighbors as well as my old embedding at time t minus 1. So I update my embedding at time t based on my old embedding and my neighbors embeddings. Then at time t plus 1, right, I keep on updating my embeddings based on the messages, based on the embeddings that I keep receiving from my neighbors. This is the idea. Very simple, but it actually gives you a sense of convolution operation that we do in case of image or text, right? So all right, so you may argue that why do we need all these things? We can just simply do some sort of you can simply use a multi-layer perceptron kind of things. You can use a feed forward network kind of things, where the input would be, let's say the input would be the adjacency matrix. Now this is the adjacency matrix, let's say, and you also have a feature. So for every node you have the adjacency matrix and you have feature. You can get a extended adjacency matrix where the feature matrix is augmented, right? So you pass this augmented feature matrix or whatever augmented adjacency matrix to a neural network, right? And you keep on condensing, expanding, condensing the dimension, and you get the condensed representation, right? What's the problem? The problem here is again the same issue. For every node, you need order of n parameters. Why? Because you see the size, right? Size is n. You need order of n parameters, right? This is not useful. This is not useful for across graphs with different sizes. For example, now you say that, okay, the size of the graph is say 100, and I have a feature vector of size 2. So I need 102 size of initial input, right? What happens when I get another graph of size 1000? So this will not work. This will not work because your feature dimensions are completely different, right? The third major problem is that, as I mentioned earlier, if I swap A and C, right, rows and columns, it represents the same graph, right? But if I swap this, the neural network will not understand that it is the same graph, because for neural network you have changed the the position of inputs. Okay, so right here comes the graph convolutional network. I've already mentioned, for every node, what I do, I basically I aggregate the information from my neighbors. I will combine it with my own information and I update my own representation. Okay, remember this thing. Here, the information that I obtain from my neighbors, right? So when I start the embedding, when I start this embedding generation process, right, at the first stage, at t equals to 0, right, what would be the embeddings? Because at t equals to 0 you don't have anything, right? So at t equals to 0 it can be a one-hot encoding, right, or it can be the node feature that you have already, right? So the embedding vector, the input, would be basically the node feature. Okay, then you keep on aggregating node features in some ways to update the embeddings, right? This is the idea. So if I only focus on a particular node, right? Now this aggregation message passing happens for all nodes, right? If I just focus on one node, so let's say this node A, right? So to get the embedding of A, what I will do, I will take the embeddings from B and D and C, of course, and C. So from A, so A's embedding is dependent on B, C, and D, because I will get the aggregate. I will get the messages from B, C, and D, and then I will aggregate, right? B's embedding is dependent on what? B's embedding is dependent on A, C. C's embedding is dependent on, B, A, F, and E. D's embedding is dependent on, right, only A, right? So I have only considered 2 hops. I have only considered, in order to get the embeddings of A, I considered A's first of neighbors and their first of neighbors, right? And this graph is called computational graph. This graph is called computational graph. For every node, I get a different graph. As you see, for A, I get, so A, I get this kind of graphs. A, B, C, D, B, A, C, C for C, A, B, E, F, for D, A. So this is the computation graph for A. For B, the computation graph can be different. Okay. So this is the computation graph for A, as you see here, right? This is the computation graph for B, as you see here. For B, I look at A and C. So A and C. Now for A, I look at B, D, B, C, and D, B, C, and D. And for C, I will look at 4 things. For this green node C, the computation graph is different. For this blue node, this is different. Okay, don't worry. I mean, although these are different, but the operations are same. Let's try to understand, right? So first question we may ask, one may ask that why 2 hop? Why not multi hops? Right? You can do multi hops. The problem is that, the more you take, the more you go far from a given node. So 2 hop to 3 hop to 4 hop, we are exhausted with nodes, because we know that there's something called 6 degrees of separation, right? The average the average diameter of a node is is 6, right? So if you move from 2 to 3 to 4, you basically encompass 60 to 70% of the nodes of the nodes in the network, right? Now for every node, if you encompass 50 to 60%, then if you look at this, if you look at this separate this computational graph, they would look like same. They would look like same. They would have same set of nodes. Then how do you differentiate? So let's not move further from. Let's only restrict ourselves to second hop for the time being. Okay. So now, so we have, say, you see here all this black, boxes, right? This represents something called aggregation operation, as I mentioned. So what you do, you get the representation from A and C, you aggregate some ways, right? You aggregate this thing along with B's representation, right? You will get some output and you pass it there. You pass it to the next stage. You also you do the same aggregation operation here, output and pass it, right? You get these 3 representations here. Also some aggregation happens and you get the embedding. Okay, now let's look at what are these aggregations, right? So this is level 0, this is level 1, and this is level 2. So think about it. How many operations do we need? How many unique operations do we need? So this is one unique operations. This is one unique operation. You need only one type of operation here, an aggregation operation. This aggregation can be just a summation. You sum XA and XC, you get the summation here. This is sum. It also sum, you get the summation, right? You also sum here. So this is one operation, right? And this can be parameterized, right? And this is another operation. So we have two layers, we have two operations. This is exactly same as, you know, feed forward kind of networks, or a CNN kind of networks, right? You can think of these as layers. Okay. So let's look at these boxes, right? Let's look at these boxes. What these boxes? Now remember, these boxes, the fundamental operations are same. Parameters are different. Operations are same, right? So let's think about it. So what we do, let's say this is a black box, right? Let's say this box, okay? And this is P, and you are getting output from input A and C. Okay, you have some representation. This representation can be initial one-hot encoding, or it can be the feature vector. Okay, what you do in this box? So in GCN, what it does, you basically aggregate. You simply take the sum, right? This plus this, right? You sum. Look at here, right? So for each V, in case of this, in our case, this is B, right? We look at the neighbors. So neighbors are A and C, right? We take the sum. What is K minus 1? K minus 1 is the K minus 1th layer. So this is first layer, layer 1, and this is 0th layer. So when you get the representation at 1th layer, you take 0th layer embeddings, you aggregate them, right? And you normalize it. Normalize it by the number of nodes present. Very simple. Number of neighbors present, NV. So this is kind of an aggregation, right? This is aggregation, but we haven't considered B's old representation, K minus 1th representation. What is this? This is this one, H of V at K minus 1. I will discuss what is W and B later, right? So you have aggregated neighborhood information, you have representation of the node itself in the previous layer, right? And then you basically do a linear transformation. What is linear transformation? Linear transformation is one layer feed forward network, right? You multiply this by, remember very carefully, this is a vector, this is a vector, okay? You multiply this by a matrix WK. Now this WK is a trainable parameter matrix. So what you do, you basically, and this WK is something which we'll learn. So you essentially, you know, to map your project, linear transformation is nothing but projection, right? You project your neighborhood using this matrix, you multiply this. Similarly, you multiply, you know, your own previous embedding with another matrix BK, which is also a trainable parameter matrix. Now, people may say that why do we need a BK? You just add, you know, all these things together. You can do that, but the problem is that sometimes I want to give more weightage to my previous encoding than the aggregation that I get from the neighbors, right? Therefore, it is better to keep these two things separate, this one and this one, okay? And therefore, these two things, these two are parameterized, okay? So once you do that, right? So finally, you see that we get and then we sum them up. Okay, we sum them up and then we pass it through a nonlinearity. It's a sigmoid kind of nonlinearity. Okay, so you pass it through a nonlinearity, and that would give you the embedding of node V in case of B here, right? Here B embedding at time k. Similarly, when we update further HVK plus 1, I take HVK and I take HVU. Right? Now this WK and BK, this is dependent on the layer K, right? So therefore, if you think of this as a layer, you have only one matrix WK and BK. And this matrix is shared across all the nodes. You don't need WKB, WKC, no. Think about it. You have a fixed dimension. The dimension is fixed. Irrespective of the number of neighbors, your dimension is fixed or you're aggregating. So this WK and BK are shared across nodes, right? But this WK and BK is layer dependent. So WK, BK, you have one set of WK, BK for layer K. You have another set of WK, BK at layer K plus 1, for example, here. These things are WK, BK are something that we learn. Okay. So now this is one way of aggregating, by the way. So the beauty about this kind of techniques is that you can make a compact representation by squeezing everything to a matrix formulation. Okay, let's think about it, right? So this is W matrix, right? And what is this? This is, so say, what is it? This is H matrix. You can think of it as H, right? Which are getting updated, right? So this is HK minus 1, and this is HK. It's a matrix, right? But think about it carefully. So if you look at this, right? So you have two parts. One is H, and other is 1 by NV. What is 1 by NV? What is NV? Mod NV. Mod NV is a degree of V, right? And how do we get a matrix which contains this 1 by degree? If D is the degree matrix, which is a diagonal matrix, right? Diagonal matrix for each entry is a degree, right? Then D inverse will give you, that quantity, right? So essentially, what is this? This is what else do we need? Okay, we also need another thing. We also need to look at the neighbors, right? Now this will get from D. In order to get the neighborhood information, we need that adjacency matrix A, right? So we basically need H. So to encode this one, we need H, we need A, and we need W, which is this one, and of course D. Now H and D can be, as you see here, right? It can be written, in terms of another matrix H bar, right? And what else? And this one is straightforward. You have H, right, and some matrix B. Okay, and then you can do gradient descent kind of techniques. So in the initial stage, right, as I mentioned earlier here, right, initially, so here, when you at 0th layer, you can either pass the one-hot encoding, or you can get deep work or node to way kind of approach, and you can get the embeddings of nodes and then pass it, use it as an initialization, right? You can also use feature vectors for initializations. Okay. So this is a very broad ideas about this. But remember, the good part about this kind of matrix is this kind of approach is that this is supervised in the sense that the final label, the final task is to classify whether this node is, say, toxic or non-toxic, fraud or genuine, for example, right? So it's a, let's say this is a node prediction, node classification problem, right? So you will have a loss function at the last stage, last layer. So it's loss function, right? Now this loss function, this loss can be back propagated, right? And this, when you do the back propagation, when you do the back propagation and update this, the W matrix and B matrix, these two matrices will be updated based on the loss that you obtained in the final stage. Now this loss can be a normal, right, a cross entropy kind of loss, for example, this kind of loss. So I understand that I'm skipping, many things, cross entropy, right, loss and all these things. I mean, I'm assuming that you guys will go through the basics of deep learning and then again come back here and read this or whatever, play this recording again. Okay, this is the cross entropy kind of loss. You see, this is the label of node V, toxic or non-toxic, for example, 0, 1, for example. So this is 0 and this is 1, this is 0, right? And you have log of this is the embedding, and this is the parameter of the last layer, for example. The last layer is a fully connected layer, and this is the parameter of the layer. You use sigmoid, loss, and etc., right? And you take the derivative with respect to these parameters with respect to the unknown, and that would further update the node embeddings, right? Now this is pretty much about graph convolutional network. So here the problem is graph convolutional network is good when it is good in a transactive setting. Of course, you can use it in inductive setting, but for inductive setting, in inductive learning, a better representation was proposed. It's called graph sage, right? We'll discuss possibly next day what is graph sage. And there is another mechanism called graph attention network, right? So far we have considered that a node will aggregate information from all its neighbors, and we give equal weightage to all the neighbors, right? This is just an aggregation. Aggregation is uniform, unbiased, right? It may happen that for certain tasks, one set of neighbors are important, other neighbors are not that important. So can we come up with an attention mechanism which will give more weightage to one set of neighbors compared to the other set of neighbors, right? And this attention mechanism is, you will see this has a lot of usage in text, for example, image, for example. Right? Attention mechanism in general is a very powerful tool for to solve many problems. For example, vanishing gradient problem. It's a vanishing gradient or vanishing exploding problem, right? It's a basic problem in normal RNN kind of setting where you have deep RNN. When you back propagate, your error will not move. The impact of the error will not move from final layer to the initial layer. So if you use this kind of attentions, you basically give explicit weightage to certain inputs, right, for certain tasks. So we'll discuss this thing in the next class. Thank you.